Hi, welcome to AOM2316, Agricultural Machinery and Equipment, and today we're going to discuss agricultural project planning. So one of the issues that we're dealing with right now is a virus, COVID-19, and here in Citra, our crops are about to be harvested. Now all of our crops are harvested by hand. So what we need to do are build more hand washing stations. So today we're going to discuss kind of the planning and the layout and some of the things that we would look at in determining that. So I had some sinks here that were left over or that were out of a demolition project. So I'm going to use that sink and we're going to build a stand for it today. But first, what we want to do is, first thing that we're going to go over is the planning stages of it. So some of the materials that we need and how to draw it out and plan some of those activities. So the first thing we'll say is we're going to build this out of lumber. So we're going to build this out of wood, and we'll discuss some of the materials that we would need for that. So there's really only three basic types of lumber that I'm going to use for this project, and one being simple 2x4s. So dimensional lumber 2x4, we know that this does not mean 2" by 4". In reality, we know that a 2x4 is actually the 2" side is actually 1.5 inches, and the 4" side is actually 3.5 inches on that. So we're going to take that into account when we start to develop some of our plans that we've got. So that's one of them. The other one that we're going to use is a standard, especially here in Marion County. We're going to use fence board. That's all this is. So fence board for obviously fence construction, and they use a lot of this on horse farms for fences to keep horses in. And the dimensions of this piece of lumber are 1" by 6", and these actually come in 16-foot lengths. So they're kind of long. So we have the 6 inches here. This actually is a 6" dimensional lumber, and the 1" is actually 1" on our fence board. So this is going to be the top of our table that we're going to make. We'll discuss that. The other piece of lumber that we're going to use a 4x4. Now what I've done is, in keeping with the theme of the class and planning for agricultural projects, what I did was I went through our lumber pile and found quite a few used 4x4s that were broken, and I was able to salvage some of those. So I have several pieces of these that will fit the criteria of what we need. So I just dug these out of the pile. So we're going to use we will be using used lumber on this. So there's a fence staple actually still in this one. So those are the three main pieces that we're going to use. So another thing that I wanted to do, so it is going to be a sink, but what I want to do is I want to make this sink ADA compliant as well. So Americans with Disabilities Act, we want to follow sink guidelines. So what I did was I Googled some information on it, some of the widths that they need to be and the heights from the bottom of the sink to the bottom. So I did that, and I determined that we needed 30 inches of space underneath this sink, and then a minimum of 30 inches here, and a minimum of 27-inch clearance from the ground or to the floor up to the bottom of the sink here. The bottom of the sink. So I kind of use these guidelines to kind of determine in the planning stages of what I wanted to do. So once I had that, and I had the sink that I was going to use, or I found that, then I was able, and I knew the lumber, the materials that we were going to be working with, or that I was going to be working with, I went ahead and drew out, visualized exactly what we were going to do. So you have to bear with me a little bit on this. So I was able to sketch this out, then I went ahead and highlighted it so you could see this a little bit better. Now I hand drew this, so the materials that I used for this were just paper, pencil, and a ruler, and a calculator, and I was able to come up with my dimensions and everything that I needed. So what I did was so this is the front view actually, so I started with that based on some of the ADA paperwork that I found. So I knew I needed at least 30-inch clearance underneath the sink itself. So anybody, if you were using a wheelchair or anything, can access the sink much closer. So what we have is, these are my 4x4s. These are going to be the legs of the sink itself. There's going to be 4 of those, but you can see the front 2 here in this image. We also have, it's hard to see, but so this is the front view, so you can see a little bit of the 2x4s that we'll have running down the side of it on either side, and then I have a 2x4 running across the top here, and there's another 2x4 on the back side of it as well. I'm going to keep the front side of this open, so I know this is kind of hard to visualize, but I was able to determine that this is going to be 30 inches wide, or at least the open area 30 inches. So I needed to account for the width of the 4x4 and the 2x4s on either side and add those into the calculations. So even though the gap is 30 inches, in total, the total width of this is going to be 40 inches. So I had to add in all of those other dimensions on there. So that's going to be the total width of what we're going to construct. And you can see the bottom of the sink here. You can barely see it. It should run about 1 inch lower than this front apron of the sink as well, which should give us about 28 inches of clearance from the ground, which would fit into compliance on that. Trying to see what else we have. I have our sink. You can't really see the sink, but the sink would fit down on top of this mount here. And it's the total height. When I include the length of the legs, which will kind of somewhat be the top, and then they're gonna be 32 inches, and then I'll have the top of the sink here, which would be our fence board material that I'm gonna use is 1 inch thickness. So it's gonna give us a total height of 33 inches. Should be important to know. So now you might ask, well, why didn't I use a piece of plywood? Why don't I use a piece of plywood instead of fence board for the top? One, I think it's gonna look better, and 2, if you have plywood, this is going to be outside, by the way, so exposed to the elements. So if you have plywood exposed to the elements face up, and this isn't going to be painted, it's going to deteriorate much faster. So the plies will actually start to separate, and it will warp, and we would run into some other issues. So this fence board material, it's pretty thick, it's much tougher, and it should make a nice top for the sink itself. So this was the front view of what we're going to build. Another thing about this, I do not have any software or construction like AutoCAD or any kind of construction or design software for this. So if you're anything like me, you can just sketch it out, get your dimensions down, and determine exactly what you need for that. So this is the front view of it. Here's the top-down view of it. So you can see I have the sink going right in the middle. These lines here represent the 4. I measured out. We're gonna have 4 boards running across. So the total width, width of the sink is gonna be 24 inches from front to back of the sink. The sink itself is gonna sit a little bit forward. Actually, put down here, we're gonna have 2.5 inches. Of wood before the actual sink starts. So the sink itself is actually, I measured it as 15 inches square, so 15 across and 15 inches deep. So I'm gonna move this sink back 2.5 inches. And the reason why I'm going to do that is because when I cut the hole for the top of this, I don't want to interfere. I don't know if it's on this one. It should be. There should be another line across here that should represent the 2x4 that's underneath that, which again, being faced up would be 1.5 inches, would come in 1.5 inches. So I'm gonna leave a little bit of clearance for that. So by the way, these dotted lines here represent the lumber that you cannot see that's underneath. So underneath this tabletop, so to speak, is a 4x4, a 4x4, pretty much, yeah, on all sides you have a 4x4. I'm missing the one right here. And then the other thing in here that you can't see is the tops of the 4x4s, which would be the legs, which would be kind of somewhere in these areas here. So it'll be 40 inches across. We're gonna cut the tabletop flush with the 2x4s underneath, so there's no overhang on either side there. And I think that's out it on this slide. So this is the top version, top view of it. And then now we have the side view. So side's the same thing. Now that I know the overall width and the overall height and the depth of it, so I have the 24 inches represented here. I have the front of the sink and the back of the sink here. So really the only difference is, it's hard to see, but the only difference in this one is because you see the end of a, you see the end of a 2x4 right here. You see the edge of one. You obviously see the 4x4 in this image here, but you don't see a 2x4 down here, because this would be the area, this is the front of it, so this would be where anything could kind of go underneath it, or if you were going to stand next to the sink, your feet could actually go underneath the sink. So that's going to be the difference there. On the back side of it, you will see the 2x4s represented. They're going to stick out a little bit further. Again, using dimensional lumber, I had to factor in the depth or the width, excuse me, of the 2x4 for the top and the bottom to represent the fact that they're going to sit flat against the 4x4. So in these joints here, I kind of turn them sideways so you can see it here. So we're going to build, these are going to be butt joints. So on the top and bottom, we're going to have the 4x4 representing the leg, and then we'll have a 2x4 creating a butt joint right here. That's what this joint is, these two 2x4s joining together. So typically you would put a screw, you would sink screws to tie these together from this 2x4 up into this one, which we probably will do, but because we're also going to be mounted to this 4x4, I'm going to sink screws into the side of it from this 2x4 to the 4x4, and also from this direction as well. We'll sink screws in there. So those are the joints that we'll be making in this for this demonstration or for this lab. And the screws that, well, I'll discuss the screws that we're going to use in a second. So that should be it. You see the bottom of the sink here. You should barely be able to see it underneath, and it's gonna, you know, it's obviously oriented closer to the front of this. So I didn't draw the back side of it, but you kind of get the idea. So anyway, back to the drawings just for a second. You know, when you're planning any kind of project, the first thing you need to do is sketch it out. So, to visualize it for several reasons. You might run into some issues. I had to make several corrections on here once I realized how it was going to go, and some other issues that I had to work out. So I was able to do that, get my measurements that I wanted, and I could sketch all of those out, run it through a calculator, and determine exactly how we wanted to build this thing. So now that I came up with this, now we'll look at some of the materials that we'll need for it. So, which we already briefly discussed. So I'm going to use, we're going to use 2x4. We're going to use 2x4x8s because that's what I have. So I have 2 inches by 4 inches by 8 feet long, and that 8 feet is actually 8 feet long. PT I put on here because we're going to be using pressure treat, because this will be outdoors. We will be using pressure treated, also known as ground contact. So if you're ever in the hardware store, you'll notice some of the lumbers, 2x4s for example, are going to be a little heavier than others. The heavier 2x4s are going to be pressure treated. Of course, they sell it as pressure treated and unpressure treated as well. So based on knowing the lengths of all the 2x4s that we need to cut, I've determined that we need, and I'll get back to it, but I need 3 2x4x8s. We could use longer ones. We could use 10 footers, 12 footers, 16 footers, you know, just as an example. But I had 2x4x8s, and you know, if we can't just add up all of the inches and determine, okay, well, we need so many inches of 2x4, because they're going to be in separate pieces. So the 2x4x8 is 96 inches long. So I had to factor that 96 inches and fit, okay, exactly where my cuts were going to come from out of that 2x4. The second one we have here is the 4x4. 4x4 by question mark. So it's 4 inches by 4 inches by, I don't know, because again, I dug the lumber out of the pile here, and there was a lot of broken pieces. So all I knew is that I needed them to be 32 inches long. So I made sure I did some quick measurements to determine which pieces I could actually get a clean 32 inches out of without you know, accounting for cutting the ends of them off. And I know I need 4 of those. So I was able to do that as well. The fence board. 1 inch by 6 inch by, well, they call it a fence board, so when they're 16 feet. I'm going to need only one of those. We're only going to need in total linear length of this, I believe, I don't remember what it was, but anyway, we only need one for that one. So, and then I have deck screws here. So the deck screws are going to be, what we're going to use today are these 2.5 inch, number 9 2.5 inch star bit, I believe, screws. So I said 1 pound. I don't know. I just, whatever screws that I had, I picked up, and that's what we're going to use. So the most important thing about this is, you know, it's for outdoor use. So you want to make sure that the screws that you're using are applicable to the situation, whether it's indoor or outdoor or drywall. They have screws as well, different types of screws. So I just want to make sure that this is going to be long enough and go through. So 2.5 inches, I believe that's why I have these. They're a good size to run through a 2x4 and have plenty sticking out the backside to attach it to whatever I want. So so we're going to use these screws just because I had those around here. Yeah, by the way, so 1 pound of these screws is about 86 screws, and a lot of times if you buy them by weight, this is a reference to go by, but a lot of times if you buy them in a box, it will kind of tell you roughly how many screws are in there. And then we're going to need adhesive for the sink. So I have this glue, heavy duty construction adhesive. So in order to mount the sink to the tabletop, I'm just going to glue it, and I'm going to use this. And then I'm going to use, with that, we use a caulk gun to glue, to facilitate gluing it on as well. So, and then of course we need the sink itself. That's an important piece as well. Oh yeah, so okay, so back to the material. So 2x4 by 2x4 by 8s. I added up, I went through the drawings and determined the lengths of all and number of pieces that I would need. So I was able to determine I needed one 40-inch piece of 2x4. I needed 4 pieces of 22.5 inch, which would, I believe, represent the sides of it. And then the 37-inch, 2 pieces of 37-inch 2x4. So we'll make those cuts in the next video. That will make. And then with the fence board, that's what I need 4 pieces. That's yeah, 40 inches. So I need they need to be 40 inches long, and I need 4 of those. So that's what we're gonna cut when we assemble. I have that one. So some of the tools. Okay, some of the tools that we're gonna use for this. So after you're through the planning stage, the design stage of it, the planning, what materials that you're going to use, now we need to focus on the tools, which is actually the hardest part that took me the longest to find everything in our situation. So the first thing that we're going to use, circular saw. So I have one here. This particular saw has built all kinds of barns, sheds, whatever, you know, livestock shelters and things like that. So this saw's had quite a bit of use on it. So this is a skill saw, circular saw. So this is going to be the main tool that we're going to use to cut our lumber. So we're going to cut all of our lumber with this. Have our blade in here. The one thing that you want to do is make sure that you have a sharp blade. This one is actually not sharp. So purchased a brand new. I will be putting this on before we make any cuts in the next videos. This is 24 teeth. This is actually, you just need to make sure it is the correct blade for what you're using it for. So we're cutting lumber. So obviously I just grabbed a simple, just a general use lumber cutting saw blade on this. 7 1/4 inches. So I'll be installing this before we use it. The next thing we have a couple of squares. So speed square, which we briefly discussed in class. But I'm going to use this to make sure that all of our joints that we'll be making are square, as well as I'll be using this to mark our boards when we go to cut. So we'll kind of demonstrate how to do that. In the next video, another square, so regular carpenter square on it. This one actually has some stair gauges on it if you were cutting rafters or stairs or anything like that. So I'll also be using this. It's a little bit larger, so I can actually make sure that everything's square. Along those lines, we'll be also using a level just to make sure the table's level. Even though the sink's going to be outside, it's not indoors, it doesn't have to be perfect. We kind of want to make sure it's going to be close to level as well. Pencils, any kind of carpenter pencils, so you can get these at any hardware store for making marks and you know, lines that you're going to cut from. I also just use a regular pencil as well, or even a pen sometimes. Drill, battery powered drill with the correct bits in it. So we're going to use a few different things. Obviously we need this to put the screws in, so we need to make sure these are actually star bits, like I said. So I need to make sure I have a nice set of bits to work with. I might need to use actual drill bit, which we'll get to when we go to cut the hole out. I might also use a hole saw for that, which would also go on this drill, which we'll demonstrate. The next thing that we're going to use is jigsaw. So handheld jigsaw here. So we're going to use this to actually cut the hole out to set our sink into. So it has a blade right here. I actually purchased new blades for it, again, and they're for different purposes. So I made sure to get wood cutting jigsaw blades. So I'll be replacing this blade before we use it as well when we go to cut the hole out of our table. Put the sink in. Sander and sandpaper. So that's this old guy here. We're gonna barely sand the top of it down just to knock off any burrs or anything, or any splinters. And we'll be using there's different grits of sandpaper. So obviously the larger the number of sandpaper, so this is 150 fine grit, is gonna give you a nicer, smoother surface. Because this is outdoors and for agricultural use, I'm probably going to use something a little more coarse, like a 60 grit. So it's a lower number. If you look at the sandpaper, looks a little more coarse. Anyway, so for general purposes, for sanding wood outdoors, I think that would suffice for us. Another thing that we might need is a die grinder. So you might be familiar with an angle grinder. So this is a die grinder, which is used for many different purposes, for metal and for wood. So we might need to, after we use the jigsaw, we might need to clean up the hole that we make in the table in order to fit the sink down into it. So I might use this just for some simple grinding to kind of get it to fit down in there. We might not need to use it though. Level, which we already covered. Chalk line. So when we go to put in screw, we don't really need to use it that much for this particular project, the chalk line, but we will use it to kind of help us line up putting screws in where we need to. So chalk line is nothing more than, it's a line with chalk on it. So this little box here has quite a bit of, or you put chalk in this in the box, and you have the string in here that the chalk is on, so you can actually, on a measurement, pull it across a piece of lumber. Actually, I can't do it by myself, but if you were to pull this tight and then pop the chalk, it's gonna leave the chalk mark on the lumber or whatever it is that you're working with. So we'll be using this to line up our screws with. And then sawhorses. So I have a couple sawhorses over here that we're going to use to cut the lumber on itself, any kind of hard surface or anything that you might need. Alright, so PPE, personal protective equipment, that we're going to use. It's important. We already covered this early on in this class. The first thing that we're going to use, the first part of PPE that I'm going to use are our gloves. So I just use regular fencing gloves, which we'll be wearing those when we go to mess with this construction project. We're gonna have protective eyewear, so also obviously important. Keep things from getting in your eyes. Earplugs for when we use the power tools. So got that, and then some form of a dust mask. So I have this respirator here that I'm gonna use whenever we go to sanding, you know, where we're throwing a lot of small particles in the air. Definitely don't want to breathe that in, so I'll be using that when we go to cut all of that. So I believe that's all of this particular video. So In the next video, we're going to demonstrate we're going to construct this. So we'll be cutting wood and we'll be assembling this particular project and gluing the sink itself onto it. So anyway, so that was a short lab, so to speak, for agricultural construction planning, and I'll see you guys next week. Thank you.